up?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jim. Well, it is so wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the thumbs up. If we have not had the opportunity to meet yet, my name is Nicole Dickie. As I heard Jim shared a little bit about my background, I'm currently the senior consultant with Hogan Assessments, and I'm based in Taipei, and I support the Asia Pacific team, markets much like Taiwan's and mainland China's, and just the greater China area. Before I was with Hogan, I actually was a part of an organizational development function where I worked on leadership development. So this topic is near and dear to my heart and my experiences, from high potential identification and development, succession planning, general leadership development. We are here to talk about these topics. So really, the agenda is pretty short and sweet today. We're going to talk about 7 common problems that maybe you face in HR. I know I faced in HR. 7 potential solutions, a few closing thoughts, and then we'll have a few minutes for question and answer at the end. So allow me to start my timer so I don't go too long. As we are starting the topic tonight, a couple of thoughts from Hogan, from me. We know that we are here because talent development is big business. So much so, you can see that the worldwide spend is about $366 billion per year. If we were to represent that in the GDP of a nation state, of a country, that's somewhere in the top 40 economies. So something like South Africa or Colombia, according to the latest World Bank estimates. That's actually half of Taiwan's GDP. So that's a lot of money being spent coaching, developing our talent. Most of that money is going into things like soft skill training, classroom-based learning, and executive coaching. So the question then becomes, is that money being put to good use? Are we seeing that our investments are paying off? Well, when we ask our senior leaders and our CEOs running these companies, unfortunately, the confidence is not that high on getting real, tangible value out of the investment. So much so, you can see here, 55% of CEOs said that their top challenge, keeping them up at night. Why can they not sleep? They're thinking about developing the next generation of talent. Now, this survey was not about talent. It was about a variety of business problems, from innovation, competition, recession, etc. But we could see that talent development was top of mind for those at the very top of organizations. And unfortunately, they don't seem to be so happy with the performance. So then that takes us to our next question. What if we ask our employees? Now, I want you to stop and think for a moment about the last 5 or 6 bosses, leaders that you've had in your work life. Now, if you are like me, maybe you can think of 1 or 2 bosses that you really liked, that you would like to work for again. And if you're like me, there may be 4 or 5 bosses that you do not want to work for again. You can see at the top of the screen here, 2/3 of people say that their bosses are not competent, incompetent in one way or another, and 2/3 of the global workforce feel alienated and disengaged. Interestingly, according to DDI's 2023 Global Leadership Forecast, only 40% of leaders report that their company has high-quality leaders. Doesn't that seem ironic? Even the leaders are noticing that the leader quality is not too high. In effect, if we look at the total picture, people report that their bosses are one of the most stressful parts of their life, not their work, their entire life. People who have real problems, financial, emotional, physical, they're saying their bosses are one of the most difficult parts of their life. And that can have effects on emotional and physical well-being. So I know that we are here in this webinar to talk about how we can increase the effectiveness and the ROI of our leadership programs so that we can show our CEOs that we're delivering that value. But at Hogan, another facet is helping to solve the problems of real employees so that they can really be their best selves and in greater turn have greater outputs for teams and organizations. Okay, so thank you for letting me share a little bit about the state of affairs. We're going to jump into our 7 problems. The first problem is really the way that leadership is defined. Okay, there is a lot of text on the screen here. So I know that Jim said that you can review the video later. I can share the PowerPoint with Jim and Intelligent if you're interested in that. But when we look at leadership, the way that we traditionally define leadership, when I was working in an HR function, the way that we usually think about leadership when it comes to high potential identification, competency models, or even who is the guest speaker at a webinar, we make a common error. Can you think of what that might be? We look at people who already have leader in their title, director, manager, CEO. We see if they have the status, if they have the title, then they must be a leader. But sometimes they're only a successful leader in title only. Maybe this is a person who's been able to advance through the organization or emerge as a leader because of their social skills. But that's not really the same as being an effective leader. In fact, we see that there's very little overlap between those who emerge as leaders, who are good at organizational politics, and those who are actually very good at developing and leading high-performing teams. We actually see that there's only a 10% overlap. So this traditional view of the way that we look at job title is really not that helpful. And actually, we have some assumptions that we're making. This allows the people who have leadership titles and the power and the status that's already there kind of keep their power and status. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the solution section. So this first one is really defining leadership incorrectly. The second is looking at the wrong outcomes. And when I say outcomes, what I mean is, how do we know if a leadership program worked and was effective? So we are in HR, we're practical, we have so many different things to do. So we ask fairly easy questions. Things like, did the leader like the experience? Did they get promoted after the experience? Did they get better performance ratings after the experience? And while these are not bad things to look at when we evaluate success, we have to remember something quite important. We have to ask ourselves, who is selecting the leaders? Who is nominating them for high potential programs, leadership development programs? Who decides if they get promoted? And who performs the performance evaluations? As you might be thinking, the answers come down to maybe 1 or 2 people in an organization. So if you can see the organization chart at the bottom, in this example here, we have Nick Tsai, who is the senior vice president. He's the one who is controlling how these people are judged and evaluated. He's also controlling who gets nominated for the programs, whether they get promoted. So if Nick Tsai decides he really likes Jim Wong and thinks Jim should be in the HiPo program and should get a good performance evaluation and promotion, we can see that it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, a circular reason. Now, at the end of this, maybe we in HR walk away and we say, good job. We did a good job with our leadership development program because Jim Wong was promoted. But really, that might have been the outcome no matter what. It might have been pre-engineered in the first place. So again, the wrong outcomes is our next problem. As we keep moving forward, we see that problem 3 looks at the wrong targets, meaning what are we developing these leaders towards? Okay, what you see here is a graph of personality assessment data, okay? So on the x-axis on the bottom, you can see Hogan's personality inventory, which is based on the 5-factor model of personality. On the y-axis, you can see our HPI percentile scores. All these gray lines are personality profiles of CEOs running the largest companies on the Global 1000. Okay, what pattern do you notice? I know you cannot come off mute and tell me, but allow me to say, you might notice that there really is no pattern at all. And the message that this sends to us is that there's not one leadership paradigm, not one leadership profile that's going to work in every scenario, in every industry, in every organizational context. So in the view of Hogan, leadership is not only context dependent and anchored, we'll talk more about that, but it should be portable. But what we find is that one leader who is successful at running a company does not mean they're going to be successful at running another company. So in that situation, what that person's engaging in might not be true leadership. Really good leadership tends to be consistent over time and situations. But what we often do with leadership development programs is we give them moving targets, maybe a buzzword or a new HR trend or a new management book comes out, and we change our leadership framework to whatever is new. So at first it was learning agility, growth mindset, grit. Before that, there was matrix. If you guys are in the HR profession and have been there for a while, you might recognize some of the words that you see, might laugh at some of the words that you see here. Sometimes there is validity in these buzz new words, but sometimes there's not. What we often see is an old wine in a new wineskin. Allow me to try. 酒瓶转新酒. Is that right? A new old wine in new skin or new, new bottle. So some of these constructs, some of these words look new and different, but they're really not. They're just in a new package, in a new wrapper. And so the problem with this is we are making our leaders focus on these new things and really distract them from what they should be focused on in leadership development, which is a universal set of demands that we know is going to be placed on leaders no matter what year or decade they are in. Okay, to further discuss this, a lot of Hogan's technical work that we help clients with actually works with competency models, okay? So some competency models are developed in very systematic and thoughtful, disciplined ways. Maybe you work with Intelligent or another consultant organization. But even the best developed competency models usually have the reflection, the fingerprint of whoever is in power at the time. So we can think about the CEO or the board or some group of leaders are sitting in a room and deciding, what should a leader look like at my company? Oftentimes, they turn out to be a little bit aspirational. Maybe they're focused on what you want to be rather than reality. They're usually theoretical, they're not very scientific, and they're very difficult to measure. But that's what they want from us in HR, right? It's the competency model. One thing I've observed is that competency models are ingrained in companies and really ingrained in the market, Greater China markets. But we also know they don't always last very long. So you can see some of the problems here on the screen. Now, I don't want to harp on competency models too hard because I know that there is a place in HR for competency models. They can be very, very helpful. Things like writing interview questions, job descriptions, conducting performance reviews, determining rewards. There are places where competency models really make sense, but they have overcome the world of leadership development. And I think that there can cause some problems for getting these leaders to really understand how they can develop. Because we have this model and we say, you need to be this perfect leader, this prototypical leader in this box. So we think there's a better way, and I'll get to that soon. All right, this is part of it. The fourth problem is the one-size-fits-all approach to leadership development. Now, I don't know if you've tried the traditional American food of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but you can see here on the screen, there is bread with peanut butter, okay? This is the metaphor for the one-size-fits-all approach to leadership development. So let's think about, we have a new cohort of leaders in our program, okay? And we know that they're all different. They might be different in educational background, demographic, personality, performance reviews, history, geography, country. And we also know at the beginning of leadership development programs, sometimes we assess on these individual differences. But then we take all these unique people and we put them in the exact same program with quarterly meetings or annual offsites. In this example, we spread the peanut butter across all the people the same way, even though we know they are quite different and might have different needs. So an analogy here is looking at elementary school students. There are many differences in children. If you have children, you know, if you have two different children, you probably need to parent them in different ways. They need different things from school. They have different interests, abilities, capabilities. But if they're in a public school, they go through the exact same curriculum, even though they might have different physical education needs, music needs, STEM, science, technology needs. Maybe one should go to a bushiban after school for English, one should go for math. Interestingly, I looked this up, that the average Taiwan parent spends about 11,000 Taiwanese dollars on a child per year. So in our world, it's not unusual to spend 1 or 2 million Taiwan dollars on one single executive program. Now, I recognize it's impossible to think that we could give every leader a customized program, but I think that we could do more than the very standard program that we often use today. Okay, checking my time, problem number 5. Let's talk about the problem of context. So we've talked about individual differences, right? But let's also talk about the importance of context when we look at our leadership development programs. So when we bring people into a leadership development program, we say, these are the activities you are going to do. These are the competencies we are going to make you develop towards. But we're missing everything else: the person's job, their team, the function that they sit in, the geography or country they sit in, even their boss. These can all be really, really important contextual factors that should influence a leadership development plan. Okay, so I have an example here. The example competency is creativity. Maybe you want to call it innovation, strategic innovation, creativity and innovation, but most leadership competency models have some kind of innovative thinking as a facet. What they're really getting at, we'll say, is creativity. So let's say every person, every leader at our organization needs to be creative or innovative, but that's a little bit too general. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper. Well, if you're a marketing leader, what does that look like? Do you need creativity in product innovation? Yes, obviously, innovation is in the job title. But what about compliance? What about finance? Well, we probably do need some innovation so that we can start to use AI in our accounting processes. Do they need to be creative? Do they need to be the same kind of creative as the marketing person? Is creativity going to be rewarded in the function, or will it be implicitly punished? So as you can see, a little bit of a dramatic example there. Here we go. Even from an organizational industry or culture perspective, what does creativity look like in a highly regulated, a safety-focused industry like offshore wind? And how is that different from a technology startup? So all that to say, we have this same competency, creativity or innovation, but that really looks different in every single context that we're putting them in. And context needs to be considered when we're looking at leadership development, because people develop in the context they're in. It's not in isolation. Okay, so let's look at the sixth problem. This goes back to your university time. Maybe you took an introduction to psychology class. If you have any kind of psychology background, you can think back to motivation and behavior. But in leadership development, we often kind of forget that we have the knowledge from psychology, and we forget about the fundamentals of behavioral change. So when we think about what we're asking leaders to change or how they're doing it, we often forget that change is actually very hard. Additionally, it takes two people to change. One person to change and one person to notice the change. But we forget anytime we're asking people to make effort to change, that's taking effort away from something else. So everyone here has limited resources, limited time, energy, opportunity in the day, emotional capacity. These are finite resources. So anytime we're asking our leaders to put those resources towards change, that means they are taking it away from something else. Another thing we forget is the importance of realistic goals. One thing about competency models is that it can be difficult for leaders because they read very, very high in the sky and aspirational. For example, we want you to be innovative and strategic, but also we need you to be process-oriented and operational. We want you to think outside the box, but do not be impractical. We create almost unrealistic standards for our leaders that feel impossible to reach. So we're actually going to look really quickly at the psychology of behavior change. There's two factors here: ability and motivation. You need someone who is going to be motivated to change, and you need to make it very easy for them to do it. That ensures that, number one, they're willing to put in the effort, but also they're able to sustain that change over time. We don't want you to say you're going to make a change and then 1 month go right back to the way that you've always done it. We want to motivate change that it's easy enough to continue to do it over time. Excuse me. So a great example of this comes from B.J. Fogg. This is whose model this is pulled from. And he talks about flossing your teeth. What he says is, okay, look, everybody knows that flossing your teeth is healthy, right? That is not surprising. Flossing your teeth leads to better oral hygiene. It also is pretty easy. It does not take a high skill to floss, but it does take some motivation. You have to create some motivation or you will just not do it, maybe forget. But then you'll just not floss your teeth. Then when you go to the dentist every 6 months, 1 year, you will feel guilty when the dentist asks you if you've been flossing your teeth. So his advice, can you guess it? Floss one tooth, 1 day. Easy, right? If you just start flossing 1 tooth a day, maybe you can move up to 2. Move up to more and more. You're able to change and increase your motivation to overcome that lack of motivation. That's what we really want to think about with our leaders. That's a silly example, right? But what's the leadership behavior equivalent to making a very, very small change on a daily basis? And how can we better support that? Okay, the final problem is really about the disconnection of processes. Okay, so I told you I worked in HR. I think maybe your experience might be like this too. If I go and speak with the leaders of my former company, I think I'll hear something similar. Oh, I was nominated for a leadership program. I took some assessments, a 360. I got some coaching around it. I went to a learning event. It was an offsite. And then I made a plan. I showed it to my boss, but they didn't ask me about it again. So I put it in a folder and I put it on my shelf or in my desk, and I forgot about it. What is more rare is to hear someone say, yes, I had a fully connected process where I learned things about myself through the assessment. Then I had some learning events that helped capitalize on what I had learned in the assessment. And then I worked with my manager and a coach to have ongoing development where I could implement and apply these things that I learned. Wow, would that not be just the best news to hear? We've tended to create these one and done events in a leader's development journey instead of making it a continuous path. The problem is that we have these missing links. You might have great assessment data from something like Hogan assessments, but maybe that does not get used throughout the entirety of the process. Or maybe on the other side, you have these great people who want to support the leaders to apply their new knowledge. They have no idea what anyone learned. So really, we're missing these links, and that's just a lost opportunity and a lost return on investment, quite frankly. I have an example from the world of exercise. Okay, does anybody go to a gym? I love to run, so I really do not usually go to the gym. But here's an example of a personal trainer. Okay, so if you start at a new gym, maybe you will work for the first time with a personal trainer. And what's the first thing that they do? They give you an assessment. They ask you your height, your weight. They ask you what your usual activities are, what you usually eat. And then they're going to sit down and make a plan with you. They're going to walk you around the gym. They'll show you how the equipment works. And then if you continue to work with them, maybe once a week, every other week, you'll work on your fitness plan. Now, imagine if you walked into the gym, somebody said, here's your plan. You can use all the equipment, and you just start with 20 kilos on the arms. You're not going to be able to do that, right? Or maybe you can, maybe you are very strong. I cannot do that. I need to start with 3 kilos. And I need someone to teach me how to use the equipment, or otherwise I could hurt myself or hurt the equipment. So it's a silly parallel, but in fitness, in education, and in leadership development, the assessments should feed everything else. They should go hand in hand for this to really be effective and to maximize the return on investment. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot. We're going to start talking about potential solutions. Now, I know that you're not able to participate in the chat, but if you have any questions as we've been going along, please feel free to put those in, and Jim and I will look at those at the end. But again, as we are practitioners together, this can be a great place to start the conversation about solutions. Okay, so the first solution, and probably the most critical to Hogan, is actually redefining leadership. Leadership is not about a job title. It is not about a status. Good, effective leadership is about the team. So you can see in this traditional view that I shared with you earlier, the idea would be looking at a title. But let's change that. And let's look at the team's output, team cohesion, team engagement, team effectiveness, team performance. So leaders who build high-performing teams over time and over different situations, they might not look the way that you expect. They might not even have a job title. We know that leaders who tend to emerge in the organization, who get promoted, they're better at socializing and self-promotion than they are at leading people. So instead of concentrating power where there's already power, which is what our leadership definitions do today, this raises a possibility that good, effective leadership can come from anywhere. There's a good photo here, graphic here, because you can see in the very literal sense, this leader is at the top of the pyramid. And in order for him to stay there, his team must continue to perform, or he might fall and break his neck. But really at Hogan, we believe that leadership is a fundamental resource for the team, for the group. And that's not a source of privilege, status, title, or special treatment, but again, being a resource for the group. So that's solution number one, is really rethinking leadership. And that feeds in, oh, here we go. That's important because what we define and what we measure can change outcomes in pretty dramatic ways. So let's think about an analogy. In this situation, let's think about customer service or customer support. If we want to try to influence this, we could say, okay, we need our time that our consultants are on resolution calls with customers to be shorter. People are on too long of calls. If we start to measure it, maybe we will get shorter calls, but that comes at the expense of something else. In this example, it's customer ratings. These consultants went from an A down to a C. And we know what's hard to measure is what suffers. So again, what we're measuring today is, did the leader get promoted? Does the leader's boss like him or her and give good performance ratings? And that's what we are rewarding. So if it's going to get better, we are going to need to produce leaders who are not better at getting promoted, but who are better at leading effective teams. So again, the outcome, measuring the right outcomes is difficult. In light of that, refocusing your outcomes. So we know that this is difficult because at Hogan and in the organizations that I've been in, I struggle with it too. So if we're thinking about refocusing on the right outcomes, we need to start asking different questions. So instead of asking, did leaders like the program? Were they promoted? Let's ask something as simple as, did they set and enact a change goal? Did they say, I will floss one tooth tomorrow? Or whatever that is for them in their leadership practice. Is there some way that we can track that and show return on investment of the progress made? Maybe we can say something like, hey, team, I'm working on being more assertive. Are you noticing any difference in me? There are tools out there that can allow for quick pulse survey work, something even like Microsoft polling has an option. It can be an easy to execute mini 360 and allow leaders to get that real-time feedback. Did leaders show any improvement after their 360 or engagement scores? So in many ways, you might have some ideas on your own. I would love to hear your ideas at the end, where we can break this cycle of circular thinking where Nick Tsai, the SVP, has all the power in that decision-making. Let's get perspectives from other people so that we can perpetuate the right kind of outcomes focused on team effectiveness. The third solution is refocusing your targets. So this goes back to the competency question. Now, I know this might be a controversial topic, but I will suggest we consider separating leadership development from the competency model. Because at Hogan, we would argue it's become too much of a burden and a hindrance. And actually, does not help to promote the behaviors that we want. Now, if that feels like a sacrilege, if that feels like it cannot be done, let's at least think about separating the competency model from measuring, okay? So using assessments can be a really, really helpful way to make leadership development insights more actionable. So how can we make that experience better? We can do that by giving executives actionable feedback that comes from well-validated, theoretically based assessment tools that withstand the test of time and that do not change with new buzzwords, new trends in HR or management practices. Okay, this brings us to a question that I get quite a bit, and that's the difference, or really, how are we differentiating what's within the competencies and what's being measured in assessments from Hogan? So I'd like to discuss that here. You can see on the screen, a typical leadership competency model has really set, crystallized expectations of behaviors or attributes, and they may read like this. So let's look at decision-making. If you get a high score on decision-making, it's going to show you that, yes, you have the thing of decision-making. Good job. Or maybe you are bad at connecting with others interpersonally. This is a development area for you. Maybe you are high on humility. Good job. Or maybe you are not strategic, which we know in leadership development is a really, really bad thing to say. A kiss of death, if you will. So this kind of typical leadership competency framework has us thinking in good or bad, yes or no, black or white. But that is not always very useful. Likely you've done some coaching. If you're an HR business partner, you are often in the room or conversation with business unit leaders. Have you ever given them a feedback and said, from the competency model, from the assessment or from the competency, you are not very strategic. You cannot set strategy. And they will look back at you and say, I set strategy every day. This is my job. So when we flip it to look at universal leader behaviors, this can become a lot more useful. For example, the way you set strategy is likely to be careful and pragmatic, maybe from your background in compliance, or that we're in a safety-sensitive industry. That could serve you well. Or you tend to set strategy really carefully, and we are at a tech startup, and so that might challenge you in keeping up with the pace of the market. Or your approach to decision-making is analytical. Here are the implications of that. The way you connect with others may be received in a more XYZ way. This is how it affects your team. You can see a lot here on the screen, but really when we talk about universal leadership behaviors and expectations, this can give a much more nuanced, specific, context-rich interpretation. And that actually makes it easier for leaders to understand what the assessment is trying to tell them, where they are now, where they could go, how to get there. So you can see which provides more useful insights here. If you're asking the question, what should I work on or change at any point in time? We recognize that there are often competing demands between leadership. Competency models often ask leaders to be tall and short, strategic, operational, nice and firm. But it can be very difficult to keep all those expectations in balance. But when we look at universal behaviors, these allow for a lot more interpretation and nuance. Okay, I've got to keep moving. Solution 4, let's take advantage of individual differences in assessment data. So if we stop thinking, can this person do X? Can this person drive results? And we start thinking, how do they drive results? That's where the individual differences give us very meaningful and actionable insights. Now, working at Hogan, working with clients, A lot of times we see leaders will look at their assessment data, use it one time, and move on. We see people get their assessments, they get a debrief, they say, wow, this is so insightful, it's very helpful, it's interesting, my coach asked me great questions, I have a great report. But then they stop, they put it in a folder, and they put it on the shelf, and they forget to get it back out. And if they forget really to inform any future decision making. Things like, how could this assessment data help me select my own leadership development program? Or how could I use this assessment data to help me think about what's getting in my own way, or give me language to help explain to my team and ask them to help me in supporting my changes? So we know at Hogan that people invest in our product, but then don't always maximize the return on investment. So a quick example, and then I'll move forward. We had at Hogan headquarters, we had a client reach out, and really this was a 1 week long offsite. Use Hogan assessments, use a 360, as well as some coaches that were on site for the full week. At the beginning of the week, they did that assessment 360, a quick coaching. And then for the week, it had leaders and teams working on simulated business outcomes. At the end, they were going to be giving a report and a report out. So these coaches were watching these teams interact and could give real-time feedback on what was happening. So for example, the coach could lean over and say, hey, Tom, you're doing it again. Remember the thing we talked about? You're being high, bold, you're dominating the whole conversation. Your team is maybe feeling uncomfortable and unwilling to speak up and give their own ideas. Let's look at how this is impacting your team. Excuse me. So that's really an amazing and powerful idea, right? To have that kind of real-time feedback. We think about athletes who look at their game tape, and then they're able to understand where they went wrong and make those changes very quickly and immediately. If we could offer that to our leaders through individualized assessment data, that could really help them understand and extract the behaviors that are causing them troubles, that are serving them well, and might not be serving them well in certain situations. Okay, let's keep going. Solution 5 is treating the context as king. So we talked about individual differences, but what about the context? We know that nothing happens in a vacuum or in isolation. We want to make sure that leadership development, we're recognizing these contextual factors because they can be such a big part of a leader's equation for success. There's an example of a big pharmaceutical company, and they had a value of driving results. But the way that they drove results was in a very process-oriented, conscientious, structured, systematic way. But there were certain areas of their business, particularly sales, where that type of driving results just didn't work for them. They needed something more about agility and adaptability and navigating ambiguity so that they could adjust to the APAC market. So again, even within the same organization, we really want to be conscious of context. Even in the same geography or function, really the context can differ wildly. All right, the 6th solution goes along with the 6th problem about our psychology department and the psychology of change. We want to say, make change as easy as possible. Now, it's interesting here because when we look at the statistics about leaders, I don't think that 65% of leaders wake up in the morning and say, hey, today I want to make somebody's day bad. I want my team to have a miserable day. But that's often what ends up happening. And so, I'm thinking that a vast majority of leaders really have good intentions. They want to do right, but sometimes they have behaviors that make them stumble and that are counterproductive in the teams and the contexts that they are in. So as we think about coaching leaders and working with leaders, it's important to make those small, actionable changes, and to make sure that those small actionable changes are aligned with who they are. So for example, there's an example of a leader who was coached. A woman had received feedback that she was really not accessible to her team, not approachable. She was very low on sociability. So on the Big Five, she was very introverted. And her team really needed to feel more connected to her. So what we ended up doing is she ended up setting one 15-minute meeting every Monday morning. So easy. She made sure and said, I don't need this meeting. I don't need to feel connected to my team. But there was no way that she was going to be making calls or walking the floor or sending an email. That wasn't natural to her. But what she could do was commit a 15-minute meeting every Monday morning so that the team could see her and feel connected during the week. All right, last one is fixing the broken link. We already talked about how it's disconnected. So let's work together to connect assessment to learning and development. Instead of making these standalone things in a leader's life or in the course of a year, we should be assessing and coming back to that data and that insight. So as we close and leave a few minutes for Q&A, I just want to say again, Jim, Susan, we understand the challenges that you face when it comes to high quality and long-lasting effective leadership development. And a few closing thoughts here. As you are working to improve your leadership development, that might actually mean breaking a few things, even old ideas or tradition, as we redefine leadership. So again, it's not about who gets nominated into a program. It's about who can lead an effective team. It's not about who gets promoted. It's about what you see from the team's perspective. As a strong leader, it's not about if you check off the competencies. It's, are you leading in appropriate behaviors that are important for us to see through on the leadership and who you are? We recognize it doesn't always cost as much money to put a group of leaders in one easy program once a year, give them a couple of shared experiences, but it might also not be the most effective solution. We recognize that it will take more than money, but it will take time and consideration and change to do more with your leadership development programs. So again, this is a continual process, not just a one-time event or once every couple of years. Okay, with that, I know we only have a couple of minutes. I'll stop sharing my screen and I will open it up for any questions.
好，各位，如果我们还有剩下大概3到5分钟的时间，如果你有任何的问题想要提问的话，你可以留在下方的问答的box 里面。好，我会把它翻译成英文，让 Nicole 这边知道。我目前这边看到有一个问题啊，我大概先repeat 一下。有人问到 Hogan， 因为他是性格测评为主，所以他有非常大量的资料，但是我们如何能够从Hogan的测评当中，也能够产出比较容易、简单、浅显易懂有关于领导职能，以方便可能高层他们也能够知道这个候选人或这个主管到底欠缺是什么。在这个部分上面，请问Hogan会如何协助企业？Okay, so Nicole, there is one question is
Please.
asking about, because Hogan assessment is the personality based assessment. So the report data is very sophisticated and comprehensive. So
Yes.
how Hogan can help corporate or HR professional to get the simple, readable report to help sponsor or the executive CEO or the president to understand the managerial competency gap for the specific leader?
So that is a great question. So as you may know, Hogan has a very comprehensive look at personality. So there's 3 different personality assessments, but really those feed all kinds of different outputs. So yes, we have very, very comprehensive reports with many, many details, but also there are actually a variety of kinds of reports, including related to competencies that you could leverage to really be able to say, okay, here's where you're falling on a competency. Let's talk about the behaviors that lead into this score. So I say that to say, I think there's a lot of flexibility that can be used with the personality data. It really just depends on how you want to view the output. Jim, any other thoughts, or you can help me translate?
好，我想我大概很快回答一下，翻译一下 Nicole 的回应哈。就是 Hogan 虽然各位如果知道 Hogan 的测评，基本上它会产出很大量的 personality 的 data。过去可能会有些人觉得这些数据可能太过复杂了，没有办法能够让上面的高层能够了解。但是实际上 Hogan 可以协助企业产出一些 competency based 的报告，所以其实 Hogan 有 competency report， 但是就如同我经常在跟客户或者是 HR 沟通的，如果 HR 自己已经有自己的 competency， 不管是自己建立的，还是之前透过参考其他的管顾公司的职能字典，其实 Hogan 也能够协助企业把你们既有的 competency 对应到 Hogan 的数据，然后去做客制化的 competency 的报告。所以这个部分上面基本上简单的回答，它其实是有的。OK， 但是最重要的是，企业要能够先了解，你们自己已经建立的领导职能或者是管理职能，是否是真正符合你们公司现在所有的人才条件。我想今天Nicole 大概有非常详细的说明了，其实在不同的企业，其实在不同的情境下面，可能我们所需要的领导职能或者是管理职能，可能都会有所不同。那如何能够做到客制化？我想这是非常重要的一件事情。OK， 好，那碍于时间的
May I add one other comment on that,
Okay.
Jim? Thank you. So because we know that organizations are in many different stages, right? And maybe you use a competency model. And so Hogan can link to that competency model, but we can also begin to bring along more towards that focus of universal leader behaviors, where there's not right and wrong, but there really is an opportunity to have that nuanced discussion. Thank you.
OK， 好，所以其实 Hogan 也有一些已经是制式的标准的 competency 的 report， 不管你可能是要去确认他是否是担任管理职能、领导职能，乃至于专业的consultant 或者是 professional。或者是他适不适合做 sales、customer service， 或者是做 administration， 其实 Hogan 已经有既有的一些的职能报告，但是往往这些的职能报告回到初衷，要先检视一下这些职能报告上面所检视的工作所需要的职能是不是跟企业的职能是否是相匹配的。我想这个是 Hogan 从 personality 的数据能够产生所谓的叫做 competency mapping 职能的对应，能够带来比较大的灵活性的效益。好，所以在最后呢，我想我们还有一点点的时间，我就只简单，因为不耽误各位的时间，所以我最后呢，只用今天Nicole 在整个的分享的过程当中，有特别提到有关于Hogan 在这个测评上面所能够带给企业去重新检视你是否能够从你自己工作的背景、产业的背景，以及你对于每一个不同的职位的期望，然后能够去透过测评工具连接到整个的发展的计划。那在这个部分上面，如果各位有感到兴趣的话，那可以参考我们在今年年底12月4号、5号最后一场的霍根测评的基础认证课程。这个是我们今年的最后一个梯次。那有人在问我们明年的时间是不是公布了？那我们目前时间已经定出来了，但是会在12月初的时候才会在我们的官网上面连同 明年度我们的认证课程的价格微调会一并公布在我们的官网上面，所以各位如果想要把握今年最后一个梯次依然是今年的认证费用的话，那请各位把握今年的最后这个梯次。那另外呢，今天其实 Nicole 也有提到哈，我们在看一个领导者的时候，不应该只是单纯看他的绩效，或者是他在组织内一些相对应的职能的表现，更重要的是他是否能够带领好他的团队。那如何能够看出他所带领的团队，他的团队效能到底是好还是不好呢？那各位不妨也留下您的时间报名参加我们在11月27号晚上同样8点钟，我们有另外一场免费的 webinar。这场 webinar 是由 Dr. Gordon Curfey 博士，然后他会来跟各位介绍如何能够在组织内能够去诊断当下这个团队它的效能到底是好还是不好。如果诊断出来的结果是不好的呢，那这时候企业或者是 HR 又应该用什么样的方法去做到所谓的叫做 team building。所以也请各位不要错过这个时间。好，所以这个大概是我们今天耽误各位1个小时的时间。我们今天晚上非常精彩的内容，谢谢 Nicole 今天带来这1个小时整整的非常含金量很高的内容。那如果各位在这个的过程当中，你有听得不是很清楚的，或者是你感到兴趣的，都非常欢迎您在今天的这个 webinar 会后呢，跟我们联系。那同时可以留意一下我们的活动的官网上面，可能再过1个星期，我们会把这个回放的 YouTube 的连接能够也会放在我们的官网上面。如果各位有不清楚的，可以再到YouTube 的频道上面去观赏今天精彩的 webinar 的分享的内容。所以最后呢，请各位在离开的时候，不要吝啬给 Nicole 这边给一些的爱心或者是一些的大拇指。那我们今天非常谢谢 Nicole 利用今天
谢谢
晚上的
你们，
时间来跟各位做这一场精彩的活动的分享。那我们今天的 webinar 就到这边告一个段落结束了。谢谢各位的参加，也谢谢 Nicole 今天精彩的分享，谢谢各位。
谢谢你们，谢谢，晚安。